What does it feel like to be invisible? To scream for help and hear nothing but silence? What does it feel like to be invisible? To scream for help and hear nothing but silence? 10-year-old Malik didn't remember what a warm bed felt like. The luxury of comfort, the kind of thing other kids took for granted, was a distant memory, a fantasy that seemed so far out of reach. Instead, every night, he curled up beneath an abandoned bridge, using an old, damp blanket as his only shield from the brutal cold. The ground beneath him was hard, the stones pressing against his back, but Malik had long stopped caring. The harshness of the world around him was just part of life. It was all he knew. His days followed a similar pattern. Searching for food was an everyday mission. Malik would dig through trash cans behind fast food restaurants, hoping to find a discarded sandwich or a half-eaten meal. He wasn't picky. Anything was better than going hungry. Sometimes he even found a bottle of soda or a few fries that someone had tossed aside. Those moments, however brief, felt like small victories in a world that seemed to offer him nothing. The world around him moved at a relentless pace, but it never stopped to notice him. People walked past him every day, their eyes focused on their phones, their conversations, their busy lives. They pretended he wasn't there, pretending that Malik didn't exist. Some would glance at him briefly, just a quick look of judgment, a furrowed brow, and then they'd move on, as if their world couldn't afford to acknowledge his suffering. Malik had learned to survive in this environment of indifference. He had no choice. The cold, the hunger, the loneliness, he had long since grown accustomed to it. It was just the way things were. It wasn't easy, and some days felt like they would never end, but he had learned how to cope. His stomach had become accustomed to the ache of emptiness, and his body had learned how to fend off the cold. The days were a blur of survival. There was no room for anything else. And yet, despite it all, Malik clung to something inside him, a small, quiet voice that refused to be silenced: hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that came with guarantees or promises. It was a fragile hope, one that whispered to him during the coldest nights and the loneliest mornings. One day, things will change. One day, someone will see you for who you really are. That voice kept him going. It kept him from giving in to the world that had so thoroughly ignored him. Because somewhere deep inside, Malik believed that he wasn't meant to be forgotten. He wasn't meant to be invisible. The nights were long, and the days were often cruel. But for Malik, there was always a sliver of hope. Even when it felt like the world had forgotten about him, even when he felt completely alone, he still carried that belief that one day, somehow, something would change. He didn't know how. He didn't know when. But one day, someone would look at him and see a kid who deserved more than the streets. He didn't know where that help would come from, but he was sure it would come. Because deep down, Malik knew something the world had yet to learn. No matter how many people passed him by, no matter how many times he was ignored, he mattered. Where are you watching from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Would you risk your life for someone who wouldn't even look at you? The rain came suddenly, a monstrous downpour that turned the streets into rivers. The kind of rain that fell without warning, the dark clouds rolling in like an army, thick and heavy. Within minutes, the streets of Aspen Ridge were flooded, the once calm pavement swallowed by the rising waters. Cars struggled to make it through, their tires spinning as drivers frantically tried to find a way out of the mess. People hurried to their cars, seeking shelter from the storm, while the city turned into a chaotic blur of headlights, honking horns, and rushing feet. Malik watched from his spot under the bridge, curled up on the cold, wet ground. His thin coat did little to shield him from the pounding rain. He had learned to adapt to the harsh weather, but the rain still felt like a personal attack. Cold, unforgiving. Still, he didn't mind. He had seen storms like this before. But today, something was different. Through the sheets of rain, Malik saw a black luxury SUV struggling at a flooded intersection. The engine sputtered and died, the car coming to a halt in the middle of the water. The tires kicked up waves, and for a moment, Malik thought the car might float away. But then, the driver's door swung open. A woman stumbled out. She was pregnant. Malik could tell from the way she held her belly as she wobbled out of the car. Her face was panicked, her eyes wide with fear. She was alone. No one was around to help her. And, as Malik looked up and down the street, he noticed something that made his stomach churn. No one stopped to help. No one even slowed down. The cars swerved around her, honking their horns as they sped past. The pedestrians kept their heads down, walking fast, trying to get to shelter. The woman stood there, helpless, stuck in the rain and rising water. It was clear she needed help, but the world around her was indifferent. People were too busy, too wrapped up in their own lives, to stop and lend a hand. The woman's panic grew more evident, and Malik could hear her muffled cries of distress over the storm. The temptation to look away was strong. He had been ignored his entire life, passed by, treated like nothing. But this time, something inside him snapped. For once, it wasn't just about surviving. It was about doing the right thing. Without thinking, Malik jumped up from his spot under the bridge, his heart pounding as adrenaline rushed through his veins. The rain soaked him immediately, but he didn't care. His feet splashed through the rising flood, the cold water biting at his ankles, but he kept running. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the sight of her, so desperate, so alone. Maybe it was because for once someone needed him, and Malik wasn't going to let her down. What would you do? Would you run to help? Or keep walking? Let me know in the comments. Have you ever been caught in a storm so strong it felt like the world was against you? Malik's heart raced as he watched the water rise, the flooding streets swallowing everything in their path. The rain was relentless, falling in sheets, blurring his vision and soaking him to the bone. The wind howled like an angry animal, pushing against them, making every step harder. The woman, pregnant and struggling, could barely keep her footing. Her swollen belly made it impossible for her to move fast, and each step seemed like an effort just to stay upright. Malik grabbed her hand, his small fingers wrapped around her wrist, trying to keep her from losing her balance as the water surged higher. His legs burned with the effort, and the cold water soaked his clothes, weighing him down. But he didn't care. He couldn't care. He had to get her to safety. "You have to move. The water's rising," Malik shouted, his voice barely audible over the howling wind and the rush of water around them. He could feel the current trying to pull them under, tugging at their legs, but he refused to stop. He refused to let the water win. The woman looked at him, her face a mix of confusion, fear, and something else, something that made Malik's stomach tighten. Maybe it was disgust. Maybe she didn't want his help. But she had no choice. The storm wasn't giving her an option. Together, they fought against the flood, the current pushing back with every step. Malik's heart pounded in his chest, his body exhausted, but he kept pulling her forward, his eyes focused on the higher ground just ahead. The water seemed endless, the waves crashing around them like a force of nature determined to tear them apart. But Malik didn't let go. Not now. Not when she needed him the most. The woman groaned in pain, her face contorting with discomfort. Malik could feel her hand trembling in his, and his breath quickened in response. "The baby. I think it's coming," she gasped, her voice filled with panic. Malik froze for a split second, his mind scrambling to process what she had just said. A baby? In the middle of this storm? He didn't know what to do. He was just a kid. He had no experience with babies, no idea how to help. But then he remembered the urgency. He couldn't stop now, not when they were so close. He reached out, pulling her closer, trying to support her weight as she stumbled through the water. The pain in her eyes was clear. She was struggling, but she wasn't giving up. And neither was he. With every ounce of strength he had left, Malik pulled her toward higher ground. His legs were screaming, his body drenched in cold water, but they finally made it. They reached the edge of the flood, the water now waist-high, and Malik helped her up onto the sidewalk. But the nightmare wasn't over yet. Malik looked around, his mind racing. They were safe, for now. But he didn't know what to do next. The storm was still raging, and the streets were flooded. They had no shelter, no help. He didn't even know where they were. But for the first time, he felt like he had done something that mattered. He had saved her, and now he had to figure out how to save them both. What book are you reading right now? Let me know below. Sometimes, the people who need help the most are the ones who would never help you. The storm raged on. The heavy downpour now mixed with the wail of distant sirens. The flashing lights from emergency vehicles painted the streets in red and blue as the rescue team made its way toward them. Malik's tiny chest heaved with exhaustion, the cold air biting at his skin. But he didn't stop. He had made it this far, and he wasn't about to let up now. He helped the woman onto the dry pavement, his small hand wrapped around hers. She was still trembling, her breath shaky, and her face pale, but she was alive. And as Malik looked at her, something strange happened. For the first time, she wasn't looking at him like he was invisible, like he was beneath her. She was looking at him like he mattered, like he was someone who had just saved her life. Her grip tightened around his hand, and Malik's heart beat a little faster. This wasn't the way it was supposed to go. People like her never cared about people like him. But now she was clinging to him, relying on him. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and a group of paramedics rushed to them, their faces filled with urgency. Malik stepped aside as they crowded around the woman, their hands reaching out to help her. One of them knelt in front of her, eyes wide with concern. "Mrs. Hawthorne, are you okay?" The paramedic gasped, looking at her with a mix of disbelief and worry. Malik froze. The name. It hit him like a ton of bricks. Hawthorne. That was the last name of the wealthiest family in Aspen Ridge, the name that everyone knew, the name that opened doors. The name that, for as long as Malik could remember, had represented everything that was wrong with this town. The Hawthorns were the kind of people who never cared about kids like him. They had their mansion on the hill, their private schools, their endless riches. They were the kind of family who had people like Malik thrown out of their property for trespassing. They didn't see people like him. They didn't care. And now, he had just saved the life of the billionaire's wife. His mind spun as he looked at the woman. She was Mrs. Hawthorne, The one person in this entire city who could afford to be blind to everything that happened to people like him. The woman who just days ago would have ignored him without a second glance. And yet here she was, her life saved by the same boy she had never even noticed until now. Malik felt a strange weight in his chest. He had never imagined that his actions would lead to something like this. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't anyone special. He was just a kid who had done what was right in the moment without thinking of the consequences. He had saved her, but now he didn't know what to do with that. As the paramedics worked to assess her, Mrs. Hawthorne's eyes met his for the first time. There was no disgust there, no judgment. Just something else. Something that Malik couldn't place. It wasn't gratitude, exactly. It was more like recognition. For the first time, she was seeing him for what he was, a person, not a beggar, not a shadow in the street, but a human being, someone who had acted when no one else did. But the more Malik thought about it, the more the feeling settled in. This wasn't just a lucky break. This wasn't just fate. He had crossed an invisible line, one that would change everything. He had saved Mrs. Hawthorne, and in doing so, he had changed how she saw him. But would it last? Would she remember the boy who had risked everything for her once the storm cleared? Would she remember that it was a kid like him who had saved her life? Or would she go back to her life of privilege, as though nothing had happened, as though she had never really seen him at all? Malik couldn't shake the feeling that his life, and Mrs. Hawthorne's, had been irrevocably changed. But how? And what did that mean for someone like him? What do you think will happen next for Malik? Will he gain something more from this moment? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Would you forgive someone who spent their life ignoring people like you? The next morning, Malik woke up in a warm hospital bed. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air, and soft sunlight streamed in through the window. For a moment, he thought he might still be dreaming. His body ached, his clothes were clean, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he was full. The food they had given him was warm, comforting, and far beyond what he'd ever expected to taste again. The doctor had visited him earlier, checking his vitals, giving him a reassuring smile. But now there was something else. The doctor's voice echoed in Malik's mind. "Mrs. Hawthorne wants to see you." He wasn't sure what to expect. He had saved her life. But what did that mean for someone like him? People like her never cared about people like him. She was a part of the world that had always looked down on him, a world that had never seen him. He wondered what she would say. Would she thank him? Or would she turn away, just like everyone else had? Nervousness crawled under his skin as he slowly stepped into the private hospital suite. The soft beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound that filled the room, and there, in the bed, sat Mrs. Hawthorne. She was holding her newborn baby, her face pale from exhaustion, but her eyes focused on Malik as he entered. There was no mistaking the weight of the moment. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at him with a quiet intensity that made his stomach churn. Her eyes searched his face as if trying to understand what he had done, what kind of person he was. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence almost suffocating. The baby, swaddled in a soft blanket, gave a small whimper in his mother's arms, but she didn't look away from Malik. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, she swallowed hard, her voice shaky but sincere. "I owe you my life, my son's life," she whispered. Malik's breath caught in his throat. The words were soft, but they hit him like a hammer. She wasn't just thanking him. She was recognizing him as more than the homeless kid she had once ignored. She saw him. For the first time, someone from that world, the world of wealth, privilege, and power, saw him as a person, as someone who mattered. Malik stood there, unsure of how to respond. This wasn't the way things were supposed to happen. People like Mrs. Hawthorne didn't acknowledge people like him. They didn't owe him anything. He had always been invisible to people like her. But here she was, acknowledging him, not just as someone who had helped her, but as someone who had made a difference. His heart was racing, his head spinning. He didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to walk away, to leave this whole situation behind. After all, people like Mrs. Hawthorne didn't change. She would go back to her life, back to the world that had never seen him before. But another part of him, the part that had kept fighting, that had kept going despite everything, wanted to stay, to listen, to see if this moment, this small acknowledgement meant something more than just words. But then something shifted in his chest. He looked at the baby in her arms, the tiny life she was holding on to so tightly. Maybe this moment wasn't about him. Maybe it was about something bigger. Maybe it was about showing the world that people like him mattered. Malik took a deep breath and looked at Mrs. Hawthorne, his voice steady, despite the chaos swirling inside him. "I didn't do it for a thank you," he said, his words quiet but firm. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." She nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. There was something more in her gaze now, something that spoke of respect, of change, of understanding. For the first time, someone had seen him, not just as a homeless kid or an invisible face on the streets, but as a person. And that, in itself, was enough. Would you accept her gratitude, or walk away? Let me know in the comments. Sometimes, all it takes is one moment to prove you're worth more than the world says you are. The Hawthornes didn't just say thank you. They didn't just offer words. They changed Malik's life forever. After everything he had endured, after all the times he had been ignored and rejected, they gave him what he had never thought possible. A home, a future, a chance. No longer did Malik have to spend his nights curled up under a bridge, fighting to stay warm. No longer did he have to search through trash cans for food. No more would he be invisible in a world that had kept its eyes firmly locked on those who already had everything. Malik was seen now. For the first time in his life, he mattered. And it wasn't just because of what he had done, or because of the thank you that had come from Mrs. Hawthorne. It was because in that moment, he had proven to himself that he was worthy. As he sat in his new bedroom, Malik took a deep breath, looking out at the sprawling city below. The view was breathtaking, but it wasn't the view that held his attention. It was the feeling of comfort that washed over him. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't worried about tomorrow. He wasn't thinking about where he would sleep or how he would survive. He was safe. He was home. But what struck him most was how quickly things had changed. Just days ago, he had been a shadow in the street, ignored by the very people who now offered him everything. It was almost hard to believe, but the reality of it hit him like a wave. The Hawthornes didn't owe him anything. In fact, they had every reason to ignore him, to turn him away. Yet, despite everything, they had chosen to open their doors to him. They had seen something in him, a boy who refused to back down, who fought against the odds when no one else would. And for that, they had given him everything he needed to turn his life around. As he sat there, alone in his room, he thought about the streets, about how the world had always told him he didn't matter. He thought about the cold, the hunger, and the loneliness that had followed him through every day. But now, all of that was behind him. He had a future, a chance. He had something he had never believed would be possible. Heroes aren't born rich. Heroes aren't born with a silver spoon in their mouths or surrounded by wealth and power. No, heroes are the ones who refuse to let the world tell them they don't matter. They are the ones who fight when no one else will, who stand tall when everything around them tries to tear them down. Heroes are the ones who rise, not because they are perfect, but because they refuse to stay down. Malik was a hero, and for the first time he understood that. He had faced a world that tried to erase him, a world that told him he didn't belong, didn't deserve anything. But in that moment, sitting in his new bedroom, looking out at the city lights, he realized that none of that mattered anymore. He had made it. He had proven that he was worth more than what the world had told him, and now he had the chance to prove it to the world. So, what would Malik do with this second chance? What would he do with this new beginning? He didn't know yet, but one thing was for sure. His journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. What would you do if you were in Malik's shoes? Would you trust the hawthorns or walk away? Let's talk in the comments.